introduce Max Blumenthal, who is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author whose articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Daily Beast, the Nation, the Guardian, the Huffington Post, and Salon.com. Blumenthal's video documentaries have been seen on the Independent Film Channel and Al Jazeera English. His 2009 book, Republican Gomorrah, Inside the Movement That Shattered the Party, is a New York Times and Los Angeles Times bestseller. His most recent book is Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. Both his books and Ali ABUNIMAH's books will be on sale tonight and offer as a book signing afterward. But for now, I wanted to welcome Max Blumenthal.
Trying to check the vote at SDSU, which is having a divestment resolution.
It hasn't happened yet, but we're going to keep track.
But those of you who are live tweeting, we're here for SDSU, SJP, in support of their divestment resolution, which is going on. Let me hear them snaps and claps and whatever else noise you all can make. It's actually insane that they even have to fight to pass this resolution. It should be self-evident that such a resolution should pass to divest from corporations involved in human rights abuses. But there's one group on campus which is determined to prevent consequences for corporations which are involved in abusing and exploiting people worldwide. And it's a group that is being commissioned and orchestrated by the pro-Israel lobby. So we're going to talk about that tonight. Ali's book is one of the first books that really exposes how this whole campaign is operating, what's happening on campus, what's going to happen after the failed two-state solution, after Kerry's failed framework plan, which he actually called a framework for a framework. So this book, like Ali, is visionary. I've learned, as a journalist that clear writing is a sign of clear thinking. And this book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, is really emblematic of that. It really presents clear thinking on an issue that most Americans find to be exceptionally complex. It's not very complex, as Ali illustrates. And he presents a vision for what should happen next, and he presents in very clear, accessible language how we are going to get there, how we're going to realize that vision. He answers the hard questions. One of the hardest questions, what happens to Israeli Jews once that vision of equality is realized? He offers historical context, and he offers a very humane and ethical vision, much more humane and ethical than what is being offered by the US and being presented by liberal Zionists in the form of a two-state solution, which can actually be called a one-and-a-half-state solution at best. So I think, in my book, Goliath doesn't present a vision. It presents...
It's kind of a nightmare.
It presents a... It does. There you go.
There we go. That's better.
And it really gives you a window into my experience working on the ground for about a year in Israel-Palestine, especially in Israeli society, especially in Jewish Israeli society, which, unlike Ali, I have unique access to because as a Jewish American with my special connection to Methuselah and Hem, Shem, and Japheth, I have more rights in the land of Israel-Palestine than any Palestinian in the whole world because of my J-positive blood. And I use that privilege to present you with this, what can only be described as a dystopian vision of Israel since 2009 under the control of the most right-wing government in its history, a permanent right-wing majority as long as the US-encouraged status quo continues. And so I think Ali's book is the perfect coda to mine because it explains where we need to go next. And it also presents in a very detailed and forensic way what the pro-Israel lobby is doing to prevent us from getting there, to preserve the status quo, to censor this discussion. Ali has dealt with this for far longer than I have. I don't know my audience that well here, but in New York, when you order a bagel and you want a little bit of cream cheese, you say smear. Where you want a lot, you get a schmear. and we've been getting smeared. Like, I was just accused of being, of inspiring these killings by a neo-Nazi in Kansas City, you know, by major pro-Israel figures, Ron Radosh, Josh Block, the former spokesperson for AIPAC. Rush Limbaugh went on the air and said that I caused him to stab 3 Jews. Well, he shot 3 people who are non-Jewish outside Jewish community centers, and there was very little evidence to back it up. But it was, you know,
I'd say there's no evidence.
There was absolutely no evidence.
Give yourself a bit more credit than that, Max.
This was promoted by people paid by the Israeli government, like Avi Meyer, who is a kind of full-time social media troll with the Jewish Agency. And so, you know, the smears are continuous. You know, they attempted to blame a Jew for what a Nazi did, which is very anti-Semitic to me, and very conspiratorial. I don't know, why are Zionists so conspiratorial? But this is part of how this movement is operating, because they have nothing to offer. They have no positive narrative to offer. They only have smears and censorship and even prosecution. And we're seeing legislation being introduced at the state level. And it will soon be introduced at the federal level to punish BDS. So I want to just talk about that first. You talk in your book about Israel's war on BDS and the pro-Israel movement's war on BDS. I was just in Seattle, and the Olympia Co-op has successfully defeated a SLAPP lawsuit that was filed against it by the Israeli government. The Israeli government filed a strategic lawsuit against public participation against a cooperative board that voted to divest from Israeli products in the United States. So there are actually, the Israeli government is coming into the United States through pro-Israel groups like Stand With Us and trying to prevent Americans from exercising their democratic rights and protected speech. My question to you, and you address this question in your book, is to what extent is it working? What impact is this having?
Well, thanks, Max, and thanks to everyone. I have to say it's pretty overwhelming to be sitting up here with so many people, many friends. I see many friends in the room, and I'm really thrilled that you've come out to support us and to support the work we're doing. But you can't all be people we know. There's so many new faces here, and it's just amazing. Thank you for coming, and thank you to everyone who has worked to make this event possible. So, for those who don't know, BDS, that Max mentioned, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, it's a growing campaign. It's very simple. I mean, when you said, Max, that I tried to break things down in a simple way. One of the strategies of the Israel lobby, and I've seen this myself, you and I were both at the University of Michigan a few weeks ago, when hundreds, thousands of students were coming out to watch the student government debate a resolution on whether the University of Michigan should divest from companies that profit from Israeli occupation, Israeli militarism, and abuses of Palestinian human rights. And the students, the pro-Israel students who were coming up, and who had clearly been really well coached, were all making the same point one after another, that this issue is so complicated, don't worry your pretty little heads about it. So it's a line people have been fed that, you know, this is so complicated. And one of the things I wanted to do is really break it down and say it's not. People get this because in this country, in this city, you know, what are Israeli settlements except a more brutal and more violent form of gentrification? You know, you're taking out the wrong people, the wrong type of people, and bringing in the right type of people. That's, you know, something that we can relate to. And so for 4 years, I mean, it's going on for longer, but in the book I really trace it over the past 4 years, pro-Israel groups in the Israeli government have been pouring, I would conservatively say, tens of millions of dollars into efforts to suppress student activism, to manipulate social and cultural institutions. For example, here in San Francisco, the Israeli consulate was strategizing with the Gay and Lesbian Film Festival on how to defame Palestine solidarity activists. You know, it's everywhere. And I guess, I mean, I could ask you the question, Max. After all this effort, BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, is bigger than ever. Tonight, while we're sitting here, divestment resolutions are being debated at 3 California campuses, San Diego State University, UC Riverside, and UC Santa Barbara. Well, that's why we're checking the hashtags to see if there's a result. And so this is happening. And California passed HR 35 condemning this. As you said, there are laws all over the country, but repression is not working. I think the BDS train has left the station.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the University of Michigan. I was kind of like parachuted into the University of Michigan at the last second to be the guest speaker at their debate on divestment. And it was an incredible scene. There were 600 people in the room. No one was allowed to snap or clap. I wasn't apprised of this fact, so I come in to do my shtick, you know, and I say, make some noise for these brave students, and all I got was finger wagging. And then, you know, but they did the spirit hands, and, you know, through them, you know, pro-Israel students have learned to do this, but, you know, there were 500 students waiting outside to see this take place, and I wasn't aware of the amount of energy the pro-Israel movement was spending just at University of Michigan alone. I mean, they've had to run around from campus to campus, from city to city, to try to put out fires, and they, as much money as they have and as much resources that they have, they can't seem to do it. One of the students who was leader of this divestment resolution was smeared in the Free Beacon, which is funded by Sheldon Adelson and Paul Singer, 2 of the biggest funders of the Republican Party, and is a neoconservative magazine in Washington, for cutting a pineapple. He had placed a photo of himself wearing a kufiya, cutting a pineapple, because the pineapple was the ananas was the name of a rival basketball club in Arab basketball.
I thought it was the ancient fruit of the Jewish people.
Well, why does he hate Hawaiians, is my question. And major pro-Israel figures, including Kenneth Marcus of the Brandeis Center, said that this was an anti-Semitic act alluding to the Holocaust and cutting up Jews. I mean, if you want, I can spend, like, I don't want to waste any time explaining how he got there, but that was I mean, he pulled several muscles trying to smear this kid who, you know, had not an anti-Semitic bone in his body. The other students were accused of calling Jewish students on campus kikes, which is a word that I haven't heard since I watched Mad Men. I mean, it's not in the vocabulary of young people. These were fabricated smears that, you know, have really created a dangerous situation on campus for these students. And the smears were being pushed by the vice president of the student council, who is a former intern for AIPAC. So they're packing these student councils with students who have been indoctrinated, who are heavily involved in pro-Israel activism. The vote was completely stacked. They got 2 guest speakers. One claimed that he was an impartial historian who is a professor at the school, but I'd Googled some of his writing on Israel-Palestine, and he was, you know, about Zionist as you can get, and he laundered all his opinions behind the Israeli narrative. So they got twice the amount of time, and in the end, the student paper endorsed BDS and said it's one of the most pressing causes of our time. You know, what I saw among these students was so impressive. I was just at the University of Washington where they introduced their divestment resolution. It's happening from campus to campus to campus. But you talk about the battle on campus. I mean, where is it going, and why is this significant because generally these resolutions do get voted down. The Israel lobby has spent a lot of money cultivating students at the top and making sure that these votes are defeated. So what's the point of doing this?
Well, that's a great question. And in the book, I talk about an organization called the David Project. This is a multi-million-dollar pro-Israel organization founded by someone called Charles Jacobs, a really virulent Islamophobe. And they got their start basically running smear campaigns against individual professors. Their first and most prominent target was Professor Joseph Mesad, the brilliant Professor Joseph Mesad at Columbia University. And 10 years later, their smear campaign is still running. But now what they focused on is kind of more a nationwide effort to shut down Palestine solidarity campaigns and really even teaching an academic inquiry about Palestine and the US role in supporting Israel on campus. And the reason, and I quote them in the book, the reason they're focusing on campuses is because they say that the future of the US-Israel relationship is going to be decided on campus. That is where the opinions of the future generations of, elites in the US, opinion makers, are formed. And if we don't shut this down now, in 10, 15, 20 years, it's really, Israel will lose its last major sponsor, which is the United States. So the David Project lays out a strategy that includes really vicious tactics. They actually use the term, they say that we should go out and accuse professors of academic malpractice when they teach things that are displeasing to the David Project. In California, this has been happening. There have been efforts to get individual professors prosecuted, for example, for using their personal websites that are hosted on California State University servers to advocate their opinions about Palestine. And professors set up their personal websites, they link to things. In fact, one professor, there was an effort by a pro-Israel group in California to have a professor prosecuted for including links to the Electronic Intifada, the website that I co-edit, on his personal website. But it's even much bigger than that. You mentioned someone called Kenneth Marcus at the Brandeis Center. What they've been doing is using the US Civil Rights Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, to file complaints against universities claiming that administrators are allowing a pervasive atmosphere of anti-Semitism on campus. And when these complaints have been adjudicated, either by federal judges in the case of UC Berkeley, or the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education in other cases, they found them to be totally bogus. But I quote Kenneth Marcus in the book saying that, even if we lose, that's okay, because we're making it such a costly personal experience for students and for faculty and for universities to get engaged in the question of Palestine, to ask questions about why the United States is supporting Israel as it ethnically cleanses Palestinians. We make it so costly personally that it's just going to deter people from doing it. And so when you mentioned that student at the University of Michigan, the goal is to make an example of him. And it's to send a message to students and say, don't do this, because we're going to splash your face and your name all over the internet, and you're never going to get a job, you're never going to have any prospects. But I think the amazing thing is that people are really getting the courage to stand up to it, and particularly students. I mean, again here, California has been ground zero for this battle, it really has. And California was where the Irvine 11, 11 students were actually put on trial for standing up and protesting during a lecture by an Israeli ambassador. They were put on trial by Orange County prosecutors who put their top homicide prosecutor on the case for students who had disrupted a speech by a government official for 5 minutes. And that's 2 minutes. Okay, I was being generous, but 2 minutes is fine.
Fair man.
And actually, Max discovered that, because they'd made all these claims that Michael Oren, the Israeli ambassador, had been so distraught by this disruption that he had to leave the speech early. Max actually reported that the reason he was in a hurry was to make it to a Lakers game. And yeah, and there was
I found a photo of him in the VIP lounge with Kobe Bryant.
and it was introduced at trial. But can you tell us, how distraught did Michael Oren look in that photo with Kobe Bryant?
He felt very unsafe.
But yeah,
His identity was threatened.
but you know, seriously, it's real, and it's, again, what it comes down to is, I think, a realization, tacit realization at least, by Israel and pro-Israel groups, that they can't win the argument, that, you know, the game is up if we have an open debate. I mean, it's the same reason why, you know, the reaction to Goliath was to try to marginalize you, defame you. Nobody could lay a finger on this book, you know, nobody. All the hit pieces that were done on Max's book, Goliath, nobody could lay a finger on it factually. In fact, Eric Alterman of The Nation, when he attacked it, what did he say? What was the phrase he used about how it's all
Technically, factually accurate. However, it is the book of the month for the Hamas book club.
Yeah, technically, factually accurate. Okay.
So,
Let's hear it
welcome
for technical,
to,
factual accuracy.
this is the 35th meeting of the Hamas book club, so welcome. You mentioned the Brandeis Center. No affiliation with Brandeis, the institution of higher learning. I don't know if there's any higher learning going on at the Brandeis Center. It exists solely to smear people like us and attack students. They produced a 65-page paper asserting that I am, you know, a horrible human being, an anti-Semite, to be blamed for everything from Miley Cyrus to restless leg syndrome. I actually did. I did tip her off about the whole ratchet thing. So, no, it was 65 pages accusing me of anti-Semitism without actually questioning a single fact in my book, which is like 450 pages long, small print, so that my grandmother couldn't really read it, but her new husband did read it. Anyway, this is what the Brandeis Center does, but Rebecca Pierce, who's here, wrote a really important piece for Mondo Weiss about what the ultimate agenda of the Brandeis Center and groups like this are. And she found that the Brandeis Center is working with an organization called the American Society for Trustees and Alumni, which is a very anodyne-sounding name, which is funded by the Bradley Foundation based in Milwaukee, a right-wing foundation which funded the research that went into the Bell Curve, a book asserting that African Americans and Latinos are genetically inferior to whites, which has funded the whole attack on affirmative action, and which is run, the American Society for Trustees and Alumni is run, I think, by Lynn Cheney, the wife of, you know, Darth Vader. And their agenda is not just to attack Palestine solidarity on campus, but to actually shut down ethnic studies and to attack all progressive forms, all progressive spaces on campus and all spaces that students of color are claiming as their own. So the issue is, when Students for Justice in Palestine is suspended and shut down, as they recently were at Northeastern after a long campaign by Charles Jacobs, who Ali mentioned, and they were just reinstated after this whole campaign was exposed. When that happens, there will be one less progressive ally when they come for the rest of us. We all know where it starts. It starts with Palestine, but we don't know where it ends. And Ali's exposed that in this book. I want to go to just another issue and take it, let's talk about students in Israel. Because at all of my talks, I rarely get heckled. Zionist students rarely speak up. Their talking points are easily knocked down. But there's always a group of them frantically typing in the corner, as if they type faster, then I'll be delegitimized, or and some of them are writing in Hebrew, and I found that they've been employed by the Jewish Agency, and I've since learned that Haifa University and Tel Aviv University and the National Students Union in Israel are actually paying students to attack Palestine solidarity activists on social media and elsewhere, and they're even teaching courses on how to fight Palestine solidarity at Haifa University and Tel Aviv University. Israel has the highest rate of inequality of any OECD country, and for these students, there aren't that many opportunities. This is a good opportunity. It's a good job. So they're actually being sicked on us. Some of them have been personally assigned to me, and I know who they are, and they just won't go away. It's like herpes. And I
wouldn't know.
Yeah. Or in the Roxy Theater. So this speaks to a section in your book where you talk about greenwashing, and blackwashing, and brownwashing, and pinkwashing. I think I've heard you say, greenwash, blackwash, brownwash, pinkwash, hogwash. The Marker, which is an Israeli economics publication, it reports on the Israeli economy, has found that Israel invests over $100 million a year in a washing machine to basically, this doesn't necessarily relate to the smears, but the image that Israel projects to the outside world in this post-Oslo era of what they describe as delegitimization. So talk about the washing machine and why you thought it was important to include that in your book.
Yeah. Anyone from the Israeli consulate here tonight?
What, they're going to neg it?
Well, they're in the book. The Israeli consulate in San Francisco makes a couple of cameos.
Is it Akiva Tor?
Yeah,
He was
Akiva if you're
Akiva
there.
if you're here.
Yeah, but this is important because the strategy laid out by groups like the David Project and another even more influential think tank called the Reut Institute. I mean, it sounds arcane, but so much of the stuff that you end up seeing and hearing on the radio and the newspaper has been planned out at these think tanks. And a really important one is the Reut Institute, which published a strategy in 2010, which was adopted by the Israeli government as their official strategy. It was adopted by the major pro-Israel organizations in this country. And they said, basically, the major threat to Israel today is not military. It is from a growing global Palestine solidarity movement. And the risk that Israel faces is that within a few years, it will be isolated the way apartheid South Africa was in the 1980s. So we have to fight back. So they said we have to fight back. And they identified the left. They identified liberal, progressive, and left-wing communities as their targets. And Israeli military intelligence, this is something that has been openly admitted in the Israeli press, said we're going to monitor left-wing and progressive groups around the world and monitor them for what they call anti-Israel activity. But at the same time, there's kind of a carrot and stick strategy. We already talked about the stick, the intimidation, the lawsuits, this kind of thing. The carrot was to try to win over these progressive communities by marketing Israel, by using branding techniques to market Israel as this attractive product, particularly to young people and those perceived as progressive. So there's been a really aggressive campaign of what we call pinkwashing, which is trying to sell Israel as, you know, a haven for LGBTQ rights. Much of this is totally bogus. I mean, when you actually look at Israel's record, it's really bogus. But the idea is to align Israel in the minds of people in the United States in particular with progressive causes, and thereby to win their support. And it involves, of course, it's not just saying nice things about Israel, it's bad-mouthing everyone else. It's making a lot of false claims about Palestinians. So frequently you'll see claims that gay men are routinely hanged and executed by Palestinians, which is totally false.
Caroline Glick just claimed that gays are hanged in the center of Ramallah.
Yeah, this is just absolutely untrue. There's no recorded case of this. But you know, so that's the pinkwashing strategy, and that's where the Israeli consulate has gotten directly involved, as I mentioned, with the Gay and Lesbian Film Festival in San Francisco. But it's happened around the country. And it's this use by Israel of cultural products as a government strategy that really gives rise and legitimizes the Palestinian call for cultural boycott, which says that, you know, when a government is intervening in stuff to prettify essentially apartheid, I mean, you'll hear this thing like, oh, well, you know, there's no gay pride parade in Gaza. As if that justifies keeping 1.7 million people caged in and on the edge of hunger just because they're not Jewish. You know, but that's what you're supposed to think. And with greenwashing, it's a similar strategy. Yesterday was Earth Day, and SodaStream, the Israeli company, is that the sound of carbonation? I think you need to replace your CO2 capsules. You know, SodaStream, an Israeli company that has a factory in an illegal settlement where there's no environmental regulation, where Palestinian workers are exploited, where the very land the factory sits on has been stolen from Palestinians, is marketing itself as a green company. And the Earth Day Network, you know, endorsed it and partnered with it until Palestine solidarity activists made some noise, and Earth Day dumped SodaStream. But that's how greenwashing works. So it's the idea that we're going to bully, intimidate, and smear people on the left, and at the same time we're going to sell Israel to them as a product. And part of the pinkwashing that has really been incredibly, I think, I'm at a loss for the word, but maybe it'll come to me, but is this deliberate marketing of Israel as a destination for sex tourism, and particularly for white male sex tourism, which is...
I wrote about that in Goliath, about Michael Lucas, who is the wealthiest, I think he may be the wealthiest porn producer in the world. He's certainly the wealthiest gay-oriented porn producer, and his top production was The Men of Israel, which is, you know, features male Israeli porn stars, and they shoot a scene in a village which your family is from, Lifta, which is one of the few really intact villages that were ethnically cleansed in 1947 and 1948, and Lucas and his film crew shot a scene in what they called an ancient home. It was actually, you know, an ethnically cleansed home. You know, in this, you know, this sort of, I'm not an academic. I bet Judith Butler could do this a lot better than I could. But it was sort of, I mean, this scene encapsulated the whole sick logic of pinkwashing in erasing Palestinian bodies and replacing them with this social Darwinistic image of a kind of more civilized culture, and doing so in a really obscene way that was sort of insulting to the point that it denied that Palestinians had ever been there before. When Lucas appeared before the film crew, Channel 1, the Israeli state TV, he was kind of hailed as a kind of hero, bringing business to Israel and bringing positive PR. And Lucas has endorsed burnings of the Quran. He said that he hates Muslims. He is virulently anti-Palestinian, and he's not only heavily promoted by the pro-Israel lobby, but he leads gay tourism to Tel Aviv. So this is sort of, and he has helped shut down Palestine solidarity events in New York at the LGBT Center, threatening them with pulling a lot of the money that he donates.
In fact, the LGBT Center in New York, because of pressure from Lucas, I mean, they caved in, it was shameful. They actually banned any events related to Palestine for almost 2 years. So there were groups like Queers Against Israeli Apartheid that had been meeting in the LGBT Center in New York who were banned. When Sarah Schulman wanted to do a reading from her book about Palestine, that was banned. And it was after, her book reading was banned and people had been protesting continuously for 2 years. Finally, they won a victory and the ban was overturned. But, I mean, it just goes to show that on this issue, even in spaces that are supposed to be safe, that are supposed to be open, that is supposed to bring those who have been marginalized and demonized into the center, Palestine gets excluded by this kind of bullying and thuggery.
And I mean, there's an underlying assertion that those who are not culturally advanced enough, who are not as liberal as Israel, deserve to be occupied and warehoused as human surplus permanently. It's a very dangerous logic that the campaign of pinkwashing is introducing, and that's widely accepted in liberal circles. And you constantly hear this argument: well, Israel, how would Hamas treat you? This kind of argument I hear constantly. We see this argument appear in liberal publications and also in the New York Times. The New York Times is one of the key publications celebrating this false image of the good Israel. Now, you and I took their last chief correspondent in Jerusalem, Ethan Bronner, to the woodshed. We didn't do it with insults or, the kind of fabrications that camera...
No, we were just technically factually
accurate. And what you reported about him was that his son was in the Israeli army while he was reporting, and his job was to report on Israel-Palestine. So you can imagine, if there was a Palestinian correspondent with a son in a Palestinian resistance faction, what would have happened. But, another question is, what if his son had been taken captive, as Gilad Shalit was? What would he have done? How could he have reported objectively? And, of course, the New York Times public editor basically dismissed your finding.
No, that's not what happened.
Okay.
Let me refresh your memory.
Clarify.
We reported accurately that Ethan Bronner's son was a soldier in the Israeli army, and the public editor, who is the advocate for readers and the in-house critic, said that this was such a major conflict of interest that Ethan Bronner should be reassigned. They didn't say he should be fired. They said he should get a plum job as a New York Times bureau chief somewhere else. And it was Bill Keller at the time, I believe, who overruled that and just said, we don't care. And Ethan Bronner stayed there. And you reported about Ethan Bronner's business, essentially, with, a major...
There was a pro-Israel PR firm based in Mali Adumim, which is an Israeli settlement, running Ethan Bronner's Speakers Bureau. So he had a business arrangement with a settler PR firm while he was covering Israel-Palestine for the New York Times. And so I confused it with the public editor's statement basically dismissing what I reported. It's very hard to get fired from the New York Times. Just ask Judith Miller. So we come back to the New York Times Jerusalem Bureau and the post-Bronner era.
By the way, can I, just
Yeah,
before we move to the post-Bronner era, you know about my meeting with Ethan Bronner.
Well, why don't you indulge
Yeah.
us?
It's just, I like telling this story. But actually, a few weeks ago, I was in New York, and I was invited to the New York Times, to the New York Times staff, off the record, call it the Death Star. The New York Times headquarters is. So I was invited to the Death Star in Times Square to do a video interview for a film someone that was making. And when we were walking through the endless newsroom, I saw several miles distance Ethan Bronner, and I thought, well, this will be fun. I'll go and introduce myself. So I went up to him and I said, "Hello, Ethan Bronner. I'm Ali Abunim," and kind of did that. And he was talking to somebody else. I said, "I don't mean to interrupt." He said, "Well, how do you know who I am?" I said, "Well, I've seen your picture and I've seen you speaking in videos. I know what you look like." And then he turned to the person he was speaking to and he said, and he pointed to me, he said, "This guy spends all his time criticizing me." And I said, "Well, that's not true. I actually also spend a lot of time criticizing other people as well." And he said, "Well, I can't think of a time you've ever said anything nice about me." I said, "Well, can you think of a time I've ever said anything inaccurate about you?" And one other point about the New York Times, about Bronner and his successors and his predecessors, is that the house that the New York Times owns in Jerusalem, that is the residence for its bureau chief, is actually a property stolen from the Karmi family, a Palestinian family, a well-known family. The father who bought the house was a very well-known Palestinian broadcaster and intellectual. His daughter, Dr. Ghada Karmi, is the author of several books. And their house, their property in West Jerusalem, is now occupied by the New York Times. So when Ethan Bronner's son would come home from his military service, he would come home to a house pillaged and looted from Palestinians. And the New York Times just will not address that.
I see I'm getting some time presented to me. There's so much more we have to cover. I wanted to talk about the post-Bronner era just quickly, and then move to some more forward-looking issues in your book in the next 15 minutes. But really quickly, the Proverb Plan was introduced in the Knesset in Israel, and this was shocking to me. This is a plan calling for the expulsion of 40 to 70,000 Bedouins living in unrecognized villages which couldn't receive public services because their residents were not Jewish, villages which contained Israeli citizens, Bedouins who had even served in the Israeli army. And the plan was put on the table in the open, and the New York Times, one of the largest plans for ethnic cleansing since 1948, and the New York Times did not report on it until there were massive protests and a massive pressure campaign. And when Jody Rudorin, the new correspondent, reported on it, she called it a resettlement plan. Like, they're going to be put in some, nice condos, and they're actually going to be put in what amount to Indian reservations. Some of the 5 towns which were built according to the Ora movement, a subsidiary of the Jewish National Fund, to quote-unquote concentrate the Bedouin population. This language of rikuz in Hebrew is concentration, and it's the same language found on the website in Hebrew of the Yad Vashem Memorial Foundation to refer to the conditions that Jews were held in World War II Europe. So what's going on? We talked about propaganda that's deliberate, and this astroturfed movement and this pro-Israel echo chamber, but here at the New York Times, it seems like they're not being paid to propagandize. There's something more organic going on. Jody Rudoran, who is an education correspondent and, comes over and starts covering Israel-Palestine, having never been there before, and you have since taken her to the woodshed. Talk about what's happening right now really briefly before we move on, and what most recently happened.
Well, the most recent thing is that a couple of weeks ago it emerged that Israel had arrested a Palestinian journalist who was also a citizen of Israel after he'd come back from a journalism conference in Lebanon. He traveled there openly. He'd posted on his Facebook page about how happy he was to be at the conference. They arrested him. They put him in incommunicado detention with no access to a lawyer or his family, and under interrogation by the Shin Bet, which is the secret police. And it later emerged that they were under suspicion of unlawful travel to an Arab country and a meeting with a foreign agent. All stuff that later fell away and they dismissed. But during his detention, an Israeli judge had ordered a total gag order. The Israeli media were not allowed to discuss this. We at the Electronic Intifada obtained and published the secret court transcript. And for 5 days, while he was in incommunicado detention, the New York Times was silent. We went to the public editor, Margaret Sullivan, and we said, we would like to know if the New York Times, and after the gag order was lifted, they published an item about it. We want to know, we couldn't tell, were they ignoring this story just because they habitually ignore stories that are important to Palestinians, or were they obeying the gag order? And the public editor revealed that Jody Rudoran was obeying the gag order, and she said, Rudoran, that, when you go to a country, you have to obey all the laws, and if the government decides to censor an important story, you obey that just like you obey the local traffic laws. That's what she said. And so if that had been the New York Times policy, there would have been no Pentagon Papers. But this kind of docility, lack of questioning, and willingness to basically follow orders from the government seems to apply when it comes to Israel. They're much more brave when it comes, say, to China.
Or Russia.
Yeah.
And so she ratifies and legitimizes the laws of a lawless occupation. And she would have faced absolutely no consequences, as Barton Gellman said on Twitter. Barton Gellman, who's reporting a lot of the Snowden leaks, said he worked in Israel, Palestine, and said there's no way they would have thrown out a New York Times correspondent. So these are the kind of people they choose for this job. But let's talk about the reality that they're not reporting on, which you have covered in this book. I think one of the most important chapters in your book that everyone has to read, which has been underexposed in this country, is Neoliberal Palestine. And that really speaks to the vision of Fayyadism, the vision that the U.S. has pushed for a Palestinian state, and the vision that they will continue to advance even as they concede that a Palestinian state, an actual viable sovereign Palestinian state, is unattainable. I recently was sent documents that were distributed among Palestinian business leaders produced by McKinsey on behalf of Tony Blair, the reptilian shapeshifter, which highlight what the plan will be after 2 states. And Tony Blair will be receiving he's called for raising about $4 billion to dump aid into this clique of Palestinian oligarchs who you describe in your book, and let them basically run these Bantustans and keep them on autopilot. 1 out of 4 Palestinians in the West Bank are currently living off of Palestinian Authority salaries. So you break down this neoliberal model and you have a revolt, because those are the heads of households. The house of cards collapses, and the U.S. is doing everything with Tony Blair and the quartet to keep it alive. This document by McKinsey doesn't mention the occupation once and actually calls for increasing tourism to the Gaza Strip as an economic remedy for Gaza. It doesn't mention the siege or the embargo once. So I want to talk about some of the people you identify in your book. Who are the key Palestinian oligarchs? And I've met them in Ramallah and Nablus. I went to the house of the wealthiest man in Palestine, Munib al-Masri. It's on a hill above Palestine. They call him the Duke of Nablus. He welcomed me in there, and the first thing he said to me is, "Are you a cousin?" And I felt like if I was a Palestinian, he might not have welcomed me in there so warmly. He has a perfectly preserved Byzantine shrine in his house, which, incredible archaeological finds that no Palestinian from Nablus can access. His home is located directly above the Balata refugee camp and across from an illegal settlement, so you have to wonder how he got authorized to build there. It is an Italian revival mansion with marble shipped from Palestine into this area from Italy. Yeah, shipped from Italy. It's incredible, the luxury that he lives in, and he is the head of the Palestinian holding company, private holding company Parico, which is an investment, which holds the investments of the 16 or so families that control a large chunk of the Palestinian economy. And then you mentioned Bashar al-Masri, who is his nephew, who is the builder of the Rawabi town. I mean, it's sort of modeled after an Israeli settlement. I had a confrontation with Bashar al-Masri in his restaurant Fuego in Ramallah with some Palestinian friends about him taking trees from the Jewish National Fund, which is, the nonprofit paragovernmental organization involved in the Prover Plan, involved in ethnic cleansing. He's working with Israeli contractors, and he just lied to our faces about what he's doing. But you expose, and you've been exposing at EI, what he's been doing, Munib al-Masri's role, and Masri was on stage with John Kerry and Tony Blair to present this plan for an economic peace. So in the time I think we have remaining, I think this really shows where the U.S. wants to take Palestine. Before we get to your vision, where do these characters fit in, and who are they, and how can this model of Fayyadism, this zombie neoliberal model, be challenged?
Well, it was, sobering and depressing to me to learn about what I learned. And I learned a lot from WikiLeaks cables that we would not have seen without the courage of Chelsea Manning. So I'm very grateful for the incredible public service that Chelsea Manning did. And what was shocking is that, basically while Gaza was being destroyed, pummeled, besieged, while the Israeli army, with the support of the US, was counting the calories of people in Gaza and putting Gaza on a diet, to use the notorious term of one of the top Israeli officials. They were pushing these kind of luxury housing projects in the West Bank, which almost no Palestinians can afford, but are enriching, these oligarchs. And then you have people like Thomas Friedman going over and claiming that this housing development called Rawabi is the future of Palestine. What they never tell you is that Rawabi is actually built on land taken by the Palestinian Authority by decree from Palestinian villages and farmers. So in other words, you have this Palestinian 1%, which is aligned with the Israeli occupation, which has got totally good relations with the Israeli occupation, preying on Palestinians who don't have the wherewithal to withstand this assault. And that's where, settler colonialism meets gentrification. I mean, the battles that are happening in San Francisco and Chicago and New York over gentrification are happening in Palestine. So, I mean, this is, it was shocking to me, because I suppose what I wanted to warn about in the book is that, Palestinians could end up winning the struggle the way the ANC did in South Africa, and then find that actually they're really losing because the land and the resources and the economy are concentrated in the hands of so few people. So the book is also a call to put economic democracy and economic justice back at the center of the Palestinian struggle, and to put Palestine into the global struggle for economic justice.
Yeah, I mean, you draw a lot on the South African comparison, and I think one of the things that went missing in all of the coverage of Nelson Mandela's death is that one of the reasons he was so celebrated was partly because he accepted this neoliberal vision which was imposed on South Africa. One of the first things the ANC did was allow the water to be privatized. Thabo Mbeki was involved in, before the fall of apartheid, negotiations with the business community to kind of kosher the fall of apartheid with the corporate titans who stood to gain and were losing a lot because of the boycott of South Africa. So, you know, the Palestinian Mandela could also be unfortunately celebrated for accepting a similar arrangement with the Israeli de Klerk. And I think it's really significant that you acknowledge that danger in your book. And you don't present one state as a panacea without economic justice for everyone. And you also include those who have been, those Israeli Jews who have been abused by the kind of internal discrimination, internal colonialism in Jewish Israeli society. And you present them as the actual bridge builders, the Mizrahim, Ethiopians, even Russians who share class interests with Palestinians. So I think that's significant as well. But we're moving to your chapter on Israeli Jews and the one-state solution. I mean, this is the complete vision. It's a very bold vision, you know, which I've, you know, been until I didn't offer in my book. I offered a critique that very much mirrors what the history you present in Northern Ireland and South Africa of right-wing forces entrenching themselves as their dominance erodes and as international pressure increases. And you present two really interesting quotes. One is by Margaret Thatcher, 1987, shortly before apartheid collapsed. She said, "The African National Congress is a typical terrorist organization. Anyone who thinks it is going to run the government in South Africa is living in cloud cuckoo land." Then you quote Norman Finkelstein, who says, I'm going to paraphrase him a little bit.
I'm in trouble.
I had to do this. When you make such predictions, you know, about one state and a regime of equality, you have crossed over not into the promised, but to the la-la land. So why do you think Finkelstein is as wrong as Thatcher is, given all of the forces we've talked about tonight, given the influence of the pro-Israel lobby, given the intransigence of the US government and the role of campaign finance, everything we've talked about? Why do you think that we're not in la-la land?
Well, Israel doesn't think we're in la-la land because they're spending tens of millions of dollars and exerting all the efforts I describe in the book to stop discussion of a single democratic state. They think it's a real prospect. For them, it's a nightmare. Equality is a nightmare. But it always is for, you know, it was a nightmare for many whites in the South in the Jim Crow states. It was certainly a nightmare for whites in Chicago in the 1940s and 50s and 60s when black people were coming up from the South to take jobs in the North. And it was a nightmare for white South Africans. And one of the most common objections we hear to the idea of a single state is people say, well, Israeli Jews will never accept it. And so what I wanted to do in that chapter was to go back and look at, in particular, South Africa and also Northern Ireland, and to point out that white South Africans' opposition to a one-person, one-vote system. This month, April 2014, is the 20th anniversary of the first democratic election in South Africa. And so that was 1994. Until the late 80s and early 90s, the vast majority of whites said that they would never accept a one-person, one-vote system. The support for that was in the single digits. And it wasn't just that they were afraid of losing economic power or political power. They really believed, and they had been taught to believe, that giving up power would mean annihilation, it would mean destruction. And Israelis have the same mentality. And settler colonial regimes always have that mentality. Insecurity is bred into them. You quote in your book the settlers of the 1950s and saying, you know, we can't dig a well or build a house unless we first build a watchtower and put up barbed wire and machine guns.
That was Moshe Dayan.
Yeah, so, you know, that settler mentality exists to this day. And what I wanted to show is that the settler mentality can be challenged and it can be defeated. And what makes the change possible is when power starts to shift. And when the ruling group sees that their power is draining away, then they're ready to talk for real. And BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, is a non-violent tool that everyone can participate in to hasten that change in the balance of power and bring about justice sooner. That's the connection I wanted to make in the book.
I think that Zionism has done so much insidious violence to Jews, especially Israeli Jews. In my book, I write about the education system. I spend a lot of time with the women of new profile, who are some of the bravest people I met in Israel, who are trying to educate Israelis out of this settler colonial mentality, who counsel young Israelis, who are lining up asking them, how do we get out of doing army service? We don't want to abuse people, we don't want to occupy people, it just doesn't feel right. And they have been interrogated, they've had their computers seized, they're under constant surveillance. And I write about a scene in a classroom in a preschool in Holon, which is just south of Tel Aviv, where preschoolers are lined up before a blackboard and they're presented with a question at the top of the blackboard. Who wants to kill us? And then the lines lead to the historic enemies of the Jews: Egyptians, Arabs, Nazis, Persians, so on. Then it leads to another question. What do we need? And the answer is provided for these 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. We need a state. And so from age 4 until they go on the March of the Living in Auschwitz, where 25% of Jewish Israeli high schoolers have been brought on this trip to Auschwitz, and they're given a week of indoctrination right before they go into the army. This is depicted in the film Defamation. They're brought into a gas chamber where Jews were slaughtered for a candlelit ceremony, and they're asked to take on the personas of Jews who were slaughtered there, who were killed there. And Yoav Shamir, the Israeli filmmaker, documents this and interviews a young woman who emerges from that gas chamber filled with rage. And he says, who do you want to kill? He asks, why are you so angry? She says, because I want to kill Nazis. And he said, well, the Nazis are dead. And she said, but they have heirs. Of course, the heirs, as Benjamin Netanyahu has said over and over and over again in public forums, including before Israeli students, are the Palestinians. So this is the kind of mentality that people are being indoctrinated into, and it is a form of psychological violence. 10,000 Jewish Israelis were imprisoned in 2013 for failure to report to army service. That is a significant percentage of the population of Jewish Israelis who are eligible to do army service. So this vision that you present is, liberating the bodies and lives of Palestinians, but it is also a rescue mission for Jewish Israelis, in my opinion. And it's going to remove them from this system of insidious violence, and it's a rescue mission for Jews everywhere, for those Jewish kids who have confronted us on college campuses with arguments and language that is inhumane unethical, and obviously and clearly anti-intellectual. And so I think it couldn't be a more important vision that you offer here. But you go even further than that. You talk about what's happening in our own communities. You refer constantly to the New Jim Crow, this book by Michelle Alexander. And you talk about African American males referring to their own communities as the occupation. You know, where I live in Jersey City, there are invisible walls. I live in a heavily African American enclave in Jersey City, but if you go towards Bayonne, it suddenly becomes white, and it's not an accident. It's because there's a regime of stop and frisk that to intimidate African Americans from going there. You talk about Arizona. You talk about banning of Chicano studies in Arizona, and you talk about you know, similar attacks on indigenous communities in the Southwest. Why do you think? Why do you think Palestine can be connected to any of this? And why should anyone here, especially those people who are the most subjected to this regime of violence in the US and oppression, very racialized oppression, class-based oppression, why should they care about Palestine?
Well, it's, to me, you know, I live in the United States, and I've spent many years working on the question of Palestine, and I feel like we first and foremost have to be part of and aware of the people and communities around us. And it's impossible to ignore that so many of the structural injustices, the violence that is being done to Palestinians with US support, is being done to millions of Americans. And these connections are at the kind of ideological level, in the sense that the American nationalist right wing, and that includes many Democrats as well, you know, talk about Latinos, they talk about African Americans as a population that is a threat that needs to be controlled. I mean, this language has been drummed into us since the 1980s. You talk about the indoctrination of Israelis. Well, in the 1980s, Americans were indoctrinated as part of the so-called war on drugs to see all African American men as a threat. That wasn't, you know, that had to be done to people, you know? And now that even this language of the tough neighborhood that comes out of the racial war on drugs in this country, Israel uses it. And Barack Obama uses it to say Israel lives in a tough neighborhood. Well, the reason Americans understand that the way they do is because they've already been indoctrinated with this racism at home. So there are those ideological links. When Israelis talk about Palestinians as a demographic threat, this racist language which views the birth of a Palestinian baby as an act of violence against the state of Israel. Well, how is that different than from when racists in this country, you know, talk about the mythical anchor babies that are going to destroy the fabric and identity of the United States? So there's that ideological level, but it's also, the ties are real, and they're financial, and they're corporate. You know, the same companies, I mean, just to give an example, a few weeks ago, the Obama administration gave a contract for $145 million to Elbit Systems. This is an Israeli arms company with the blood of thousands of people on its hands. And this contract was for surveillance systems along the US-Mexico border. Well, where does Elbit Systems develop and test those surveillance systems? On Palestinians under occupation, along the apartheid wall that the International Court of Justice has declared illegal. So the Palestinians are the laboratory animals for Israel's so-called homeland security industry, and then those technologies are brought here to control who? Let's be real, it's not white people in the suburbs, and it's not the people moving into the new condominiums in San Francisco and Chicago and New York. So we can't ignore it. Companies like G4S, which is a private prison contractor, one of the biggest in the United States, but it's helping Israel run detention centers like Al-Jalame and Megiddo prison, where Palestinian children are tortured. And so they're making profits there, and they're making profits here. So that's why what's happening tonight at San Diego State, at Riverside, at UC Santa Barbara, and campuses all over this country is so important, because it's the university presidents, it's the Dianne Feinsteins and Barbara Boxers and the Barack Obamas who are saying we can never divest. It's students who are the conscience right now. It's students who are standing up to these institutions and saying, we want accountability. And the amazing thing is they're connecting it to the prison industry. They're connecting it to mass incarceration. They're connecting it to border militarization. They're connecting it to divestment from fossil fuels. So if we're going to win, it's not going to be fighting separate battles. It's going to be when we connect things. And when the enemy works together, so we have to work together. It's as simple as that.
I wanted to just talk about just a little anecdote from a trip I recently took to Israel, Palestine, and I met a friend named Yossi David who identifies as an Arab Jew. He was raised ultra-Orthodox, basically left his family and his parents because his yeshiva had grown too extreme. He was told to join the Israeli army to become secular. He turned against the army, and he started to discover his roots in the Middle East and in the Arab world, and he decided, I want to stay here. This is my place. I want to live here without Zionism. And he took me one night to the Mahane Yehuda market in Jerusalem. If you go there in the daytime, you'll see it's a lot of settlers. It's an almost exclusively Jewish scene. It's very crowded. There was almost no one there in this market. And I heard the sounds of Kulthum reverberating through these stone halls, this famous Egyptian Tarab singer. And I said, where are you taking me? What's going on here? And he took me to a small cafe called Tahrir. All the staff was Palestinian, Jerusalem Palestinians, and it was filled with Palestinians and Mizrahim, and it was like, what happens after dark when the white people are gone? They were, these were religious Mizrahi Jews with kippot on, and everybody had pictures of Arak, and they were taking turns at a laptop with a PA system playing their favorite Arab music. Including Sami Maghrebi, the Jewish Moroccan singer and oud player. And this really was a vision of the kind of future that could take place when the separation breaks down. It was a small, very small, tiny scintilla of a vision that is the kind that I think Ali and I want to realize, and that's really laid out in Ali's book, and I think that's what we're all here for, and it's what we need to present and accept, and we should accept nothing less than that.
Thank you very much.